April 16, 1945. Weimar, Germany. The sun breaks hesitantly over the cobblestone streets of Weimar, casting long shadows across the shuttered windows of half-timbered houses. Behind lace curtains, trembling hands pull fabric aside just enough to see. The rumble approaches from the west, not the familiar grinding of Wehrmacht half-tracks, but something deeper, more numerous. American Sherman tanks roll into the city square, their white stars brilliant against olive-drab steel. In doorways and cellars throughout the town, German civilians hold their breath, waiting for the retribution they have been told to expect. Mothers clutch children. Old men grip whatever implements they can find. The propaganda films they watched in darkened cinemas promised that enemy. Soldiers would come as barbarians, as destroyers of civilization itself. Now those soldiers are here, and the waiting becomes unbearable. For 12 years, the German people had lived under a regime that spoke constantly of enemies, the Bolshevik hordes from the east who would defile German womanhood, the Western plutocrats who would starve German children as they had during the blockade of the Great War. Goebbels' voice had crackled through every radio, painting pictures of what defeat would mean: savage retribution, cultural annihilation, the end of the German Volk itself. Wehrmacht soldiers returning from the Eastern Front spoke in hushed tones of what happened in occupied territories there, the brutal mathematics of partisan warfare and reprisal. The civilians of Weimar, like those in 10,000 German towns, believed they knew what occupation meant. They had seen the newsreels from Poland, from France, from the conquered territory where German authority had been absolute and often merciless. Now the roles were reversed, and they braced for the mirror image of what their own forces had delivered. But the Americans who dismounted from those tanks did not match the propaganda. They were young men, most of them, with faces that could have belonged to farm boys or shopkeepers. They chewed gum, an alien habit that struck the watching Germans as both casual and somehow prosperous. They moved with a relaxed efficiency that seemed almost careless compared to the rigid discipline of Wehrmacht formation. Officers consulted maps and pointed, directing traffic with hand signals rather than shouted commands. And crucially, terrifyingly, unexpectedly, they did not kick down doors. The first hours passed without the systematic violence that every German citizen had been conditioned to anticipate. Instead, loudspeakers mounted on jeeps announced curfews in accented but comprehensible German. Military police began posting notices. Civilians were to remain in their homes between certain hours. Food distribution points would be established. Weapons were to be surrendered without reprisal. The word "without reprisal" appeared again and again in those early proclamations. To German ears, schooled in 12 years of total war ideology, it sounded almost naive. Hildegard Weber, a schoolteacher who kept a diary throughout the occupation, wrote on that first night, "They did not come with fire. This is perhaps the most shocking thing. We prepared for apocalypse and received bureaucracy instead." Her confusion was shared by thousands. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The enemy was supposed to be subhuman, yet behaved with restraint. They were supposed to be destroyers of culture, yet the first military government officers began immediately cataloging which buildings had historical significance and posting them off-limits to requisition. The Americans seemed almost indifferent to the psychological surrender the German civilians had prepared themselves for. Instead of grand gestures of humiliation, there were endless forms, inventories, ration schedules. The German expectation had been shaped not only by propaganda, but by the German military's own conduct across occupied Europe. In Poland, in the Soviet Union, in Yugoslavia, occupation had meant the systematic assertion of racial supremacy, the casual violence of a master race governing subhumans. German civilians, even those who had never worn a uniform, understood this because it had been explained to them as natural, necessary, the inevitable order of a German Europe. Surely the Americans would operate by the same logic, only inverted. Surely they would exact proportional revenge. This was the calculus of total war. You inflict suffering, you receive suffering. You destroy, you are destroyed. The scales must balance. But the scales did not balance, and this imbalance became its own form of psychological warfare. In the town of Kronberg, American soldiers discovered an elderly couple who had locked themselves in their cellar, prepared to die rather than face occupation forces. When the GIs coaxed them out with offers of K-rations and cigarettes rather than violence, Old Man wept not from relief, but from a confusion so deep it bordered on existential crisis. His son had been a tank commander who died at Kursk. He had read his son's letters describing what happened in Russian villages. He knew what he deserved, and the Americans' refusal to deliver it felt like a violation of cosmic justice. The food became the most visible symbol of this strange new order. Within days of occupation, American supply trucks began distributing rations to German civilians, not generously, for Europe was starving and resources were scarce, but with a systematic fairness that seemed to make no distinction between victor and vanquished beyond basic military necessity. German children, hollow-eyed from years of ersatz bread and turnip soup, received chocolate bars from soldiers who seemed to produce them from infinite pockets. Real chocolate, not the sawdust and sugar substitutes they had known. Each bar was a small brown rectangle of cognitive warfare, proof that the American supply chain was so robust it could afford to be casual about abundance even in the wake of conquest. Frau Ingrid Holtzmann, a widow whose husband had died in Normandy, recorded this encounter in May 1945. A Negro soldier, the kind our propaganda said were savages, gave my daughter a chocolate bar and asked her age in broken German. When she told him she was 7, he pulled out a photograph of his own daughter, the same age. He smiled at her like she was any child. I do not know what to think anymore. This moment, repeated in 1,000 variations across occupied Germany, did more to undermine 12 years of racial ideology than any number of denazification lectures could have achieved. The Americans brought with them not just military power, but a casual egalitarianism that was incomprehensible to people raised under fascism. The black soldiers and white soldiers serving together, the Jewish officers whose names appeared on requisition orders, the apparent indifference to racial hierarchy, all of it contradicted the foundational myths the German people had been fed. Yet restraint was not mercy in any soft sense. When the Americans marched the citizens of Weimar through Buchenwald concentration camp on April 16th, forcing them to witness what had existed just miles from their homes, the restraint took on a harder edge. No one was shot for looking away, but everyone was required to look. The burgomaster of Weimar committed suicide that night, unable to reconcile what he had seen with the civilization he thought he had been defending. The Americans did not execute him, he executed himself. This was perhaps the most sophisticated form of punishment, forcing confrontation with moral reality rather than inflicting physical retribution. The restraint was not weakness, but a different kind of power. The power to make people judge themselves. Military Government Law Number 1, issued by General Eisenhower, established the framework. For occupation, German civilians would be held responsible for crimes committed under Nazi rule, but collective punishment was forbidden. Individual justice would be pursued through military tribunals and later through German courts under Allied supervision. This legalistic approach baffled a population accustomed to Sippenhaft, the Nazi practice of punishing entire families for one member's crime. The Americans insisted on documentation, evidence, individual culpability. They built courtrooms instead of execution yards. The Nuremberg trials would later exemplify this approach, but it began in the first days of occupation when military police took statements rather than taking revenge. Not all German civilians responded with relief. Some found the restraint insulting, as if their defeat did not matter enough to warrant dramatic retribution. Others, particularly committed Nazis, interpreted American decency as weakness, a sign that democracy was too soft to hold conquered territory. These were the people who would later form the werewolf resistance cells, though those groups proved far less effective than Nazi propaganda had promised they would be. The vast majority of Germans, exhausted by war and desperate for stability, simply adapted. They learned that cooperation with occupation authorities brought food, fuel, and safety. They learned that the Americans meant what their proclamations said. Trust came slowly, cautiously, but it came. The contrast with Soviet occupation in the eastern zones could not have been starker. Refugees fleeing westward brought stories of systematic rape, industrial looting, and summary execution. The Americans heard these stories too, and sometimes used them as examples in their own governance. "This is what we choose not to do," became an implicit message. The restraint was in part strategic, a demonstration that American-style democracy offered better conditions than Soviet communism, but it was also genuine, rooted in constitutional tradition and military discipline. The United States Army had its share of criminal acts committed by individual soldiers, and these were prosecuted by American courts martial, another concept that astonished Germans. An occupying army that imprisoned its own men for crimes against the occupied population. By summer 1945, the patterns of occupation had solidified. German civilians learned to navigate the military government bureaucracy, to secure travel permits and ration cards, to petition for the return of sequestered property. American jazz played from radios in requisitioned villas where occupation officers established headquarters. German women who fraternized with American soldiers were condemned by some neighbors and envied by others. The non-fraternization policy formally ended that year, though it had never been effectively enforced. Children learned English phrases to beg for gum and candy from passing GS. The economy began its long, slow reconstruction under the Marshall Plan framework that would soon emerge. Democracy was being administered like medicine, in measured doses through education programs and licensed newspapers and reformed school curricula. The chocolate bars kept coming, those small brown rectangles wrapped in wax paper. They became legendary among German children, a symbol of American abundance that contrasted sharply with years of rationing and privation. Each bar represented a supply chain that stretched across an ocean and industrial capacity so vast it could afford to give away luxury goods in a conquered land. But they symbolized something more than abundance. They represented a worldview in which prosperity was not a zero-sum game, in which the victor could afford generosity because victory itself was so complete. The chocolate said, "We have so much that we can give you this, and it costs us nothing we will miss." This was a kind of power that German militarism had never understood. Power rooted not in scarcity and struggle, but in production and plenty. Protestant pastor Martin Scheffer wrote in his church diary, "In November 1945, we prepared our souls for punishment and received instead an invitation to reform. The Americans treat us not as eternal enemies, but as temporary criminals who might be rehabilitated. This is more unsettling than hatred would have been. Hatred we understood. This practical mercy is foreign to us." His words captured the profound ideological shift that American occupation forced upon German consciousness. For 12 years, Germans had been told that the world was a battleground of racial destiny, that conflict was eternal, that only strength mattered. The Americans arrived with a different proposition. Conflict could be resolved, societies could be rebuilt, enemies could become allies. This was not stated as lofty principle, but demonstrated through administrative action, through the grinding work of reconstruction and reform. The restraint extended even into areas where vengeance would have been legally justified. German scientists who had developed weapons for the Nazi regime were not executed but recruited for American projects. German engineers who had kept war factories running were soon running reconstruction efforts. The calculation was pragmatic skills were needed for rebuilding, but the symbolism was powerful. The future mattered more than the past. Function mattered more than retribution. This was a profoundly German way of thinking, at least within the framework of Nazi ideology. It suggested that societies could be rebuilt from the inside, that people could change, that redemption was possible without romantic martyrdom. By 1946, as the first cold winter of peace settled over Germany, the contrast between expectation and reality had become undeniable, even to the most skeptical Germans. The Americans had not come as destroyers, but as administrators. They had not imposed slavery, but insisted on denazification and democratization. They had not starved the population, but organized food distribution with industrial efficiency. The occupation was not pleasant. Germany was defeated, occupied, divided, and devastated, but it was not the apocalypse that Goebbels had promised. And in that gap between prophecy and reality, something new became possible. Germans began to imagine a future beyond racial destiny and total war, a future that looked oddly like the American present, prosperous, democratic, boring. The restraint was never perfect. There were crimes committed by occupation forces, failures of justice, moments of humiliation and hardship, but the overall pattern held: individual accountability over collective punishment, law over vengeance, reconstruction over destruction. This pattern would shape West Germany's integration into the Western Alliance, would make possible the economic miracle of the 1950s, would transform enemies into allies within a single generation. The restraint was, in the end, more devastating to Nazi ideology than any amount of revenge could have been. It proved that strength did not require cruelty, that victory did not demand humiliation, that a different kind of civilization was possible. In the ruins of Weimar, in the quiet desperation of 1,000 occupied towns, German civilians learned a lesson that no propaganda film or military defeat could have taught them. They learned that the Americans who rolled into their town squares with chewing gum and K-rash and chocolate bars represented something genuinely different from what they had known. Not better in some abstract moral sense. The Germans had lost the war, and with it the right to judge their conquerors, but different in practice, different in assumption, different in possibility. The restraint was not mercy. It was not forgiveness. It was something stranger and more powerful. It was the demonstration that democracy could be boring, efficient, abundant, and still win. That freedom did not require mysticism or racial destiny, but could be delivered through supply chains and bureaucratic competence and chocolate bars given to children whose fathers had died fighting against everything America represented. The occupation ended officially in 1949 when West Germany became a sovereign state, but its effects lasted generations. German civilians who had expected apocalypse and received administration instead became the architects of a new Germany, one that rejected militarism and embraced democracy, not because they had been convinced by moral argument, but because they had seen the practical results. The restraint taught them that there were forms of power beyond military dominance, that prosperity was a better foundation for society than glory, that the mundane work of building democracy was more durable than the romantic myths of empire. In the end, the Americans conquered Germany twice, once with armies and once with chocolate bars. The first conquest ended the war, the second conquest built the peace.